Hello, my name is Supriya Sharma. I head research for CICO, and I'm back. Back with talking about questions around themes that are are potentially going to contribute towards building this massive ecosystem for startups in the country. We've been doing these conversations for some time now, and over the last couple of these chats, we've taken up subjects, matters, topics that are potentially revealing actionable insights for incubator managers, specifically for those that are located in tier 2, tier 3 regions in the country. For this conversation, I'm picking up on one of our previous ones where we spoke about how important is it for an incubator to create a positioning for themselves, for them to be able to define their quote unquote value proposition, their product portfolio. Putting my hook in that conversation. Today, we will talk about programs, largely also because the word programs and incubation often gets mentioned in the same sentence. But if you also look at the ecosystem, you find a wide variety of programs of varying quality, varying durations, enough variety there. But I'm not saying all programs must be the same. However, the similarity in our view should be in what each program aims to achieve in terms of impact, in terms of the outcomes that follow for the startup and the ecosystem at large. I will bring in my colleague, Chintan Bakshi. He's been doing programs, mentoring other incubators, develop programs, develop interventions, and many of them have seen the impact that they set out to achieve. Chintan, can I bring you in now?
Hi, Supriya. Just a quick introduction. My name is Chintan Bakshi, and I am partner incubation at CICO. I lead a lot of the regional initiatives that we do across geographies, working with very early stage tier 2, tier 3 city entrepreneurs across these geographies, which includes Gujarat, Rajasthan, MP, Assam, to name a few, where we have physical presence, and other geographies which have tier 2, tier 3 cities, where we currently are doing multiple virtual programs too.
Great, Chintan. Let's talk about programs. Any incubator, as they are founded, they essentially begin with doing programs or interventions of some form. I'm going to start with a fundamental question: how would you define what is a program? What features would sort of constitute a program?
Yeah. No, I would say programs are really the heart of any incubation center, and these are the sort of products which actually deliver value for entrepreneurs. To give a very simple framework, we look at startups in 4 stages. There's probably an initial ideation phase. There is maybe a prototyping phase where they are doing some validation with customers. There's an MVP or a business model validation phase, and then there's a sort of getting ready for growth sort of phase. These are the 4 phases where incubation centers in generally operate in. Post-growth phase, maybe the startup is beyond the scope of an incubation center. They may be working with other investors and VCs, etc., to help them go forward. The reason why I introduced these 4 phases is one of the ways to look at it is that a program is designed to help a startup, what we call within CICO, achieve orbit change. And that broadly can be looked at as enabling them from moving from one stage to the other. We could have intermediate stages also. There could be an alpha prototype and a beta prototype, etc., or there could be an early MVP or a later stage, more mature MVP. But broadly, a program is, a time-bound sort of set of activities, sessions, mentoring programs, etc., which deliver value in a compact format to a startup to help them move from one stage to the other. And why it's important is because that's what an incubation center is, and it is supposed to do. It's supposed to essentially help startup go to the next phase to get over some of the risks associated with the earlier phase, do validations, and then sort of go to the next phase, and where hopefully at some point of time they have done enough validation that they start becoming attractive for investments and external investors, etc., coming in. So broadly, that's I think what a program is, and I think we could maybe look at other features as we go along in the conversation.
Right. So I agree that incubators must be cognizant of the phases through which a startup progresses along their journey. So are you also saying that the constituents of a program could differ across these stages?
Yes,
And
they could.
if you could also talk about some constituents. Sorry to be speaking another question there.
Yeah. No. I think maybe I'll start with the second part of the question, that what could be the key constituents of a program. So within based on our experience at CICO, we have looked at the following 5 or 6 basic constituents, which constitute a program. Of course, based on whether a program is supposed to help a startup move from ideation to prototyping or prototyping to MVP. Some of these may be more important than the others, and I'll try to explain that later. But basically, the fundamental constituents could be the following. There would need to be some learning sessions, structured learning sessions, one-to-many. The objective of these sessions is to make sure that if you have a cohort of 5, 10, 15, 20 startups, at least they are up to speed on some of the basic concepts that are relevant at that stage. Right? So, for example, someone who's at a prototyping stage, may not be how to scale up and how to kind of do valuation, etc., may not be very important for them. But something like customer validation, market research, rapid prototyping, some element of unit economics, because that needs to be looked at, though you're not validating that. I think that becomes important at that stage. So first is learning modules to get the cohort up to speed. The second thing that we typically would look at is doing some level of diagnostics. That's really the first stage in trying to define what a startup needs. So it could be done through the means of diagnostic panels, where a startup pitches to a panel of mentors who are experts, which could be drawn in from various domains. You could have typically a functional mentor or a domain expert, or someone who's like a startup expert, some startup founder who has successfully done a startup broadly in that area, and that constitutes a panel. And the objective of the panel is to really diagnose what are the 1 or 2 or 3 red flags that one sees in that startup, given the product they are building, given the customer, given the domain, etc. Then we go to the next level of doing what we call as mentoring clinics. I mean, these are solutions. So how do we get over these red flags? How do we get over these? How do we solve these problems? So again, it's similar to a mentoring, similar to a diagnostic panel, that you'll have a bunch of experts coming in, mentors coming in, and some brainstorming happens in terms of directions. Another very important stage is what we call as sprints. That's really validating solutions. To make sure that whatever are the suggestions that the mentors are given, the startup is able to validate it. Because that's really one of the core principles of building a startup, is that if you can't validate it, there's nothing much you can do about it. And finally, there would be, typically towards the end of a program, there would be some sort of a demo session. You could have demos to investors. You could have demos to grant makers in case it's an early startup. You could have demos to potential customers, B2B sort of customers, large retailers, in case the product is relevant for that. So there could be various kinds of demos where the objective is to kind of bring the startup in front of such organizations, investors, etc., who can help them go to the next level.
Very, very helpful, Chintan, and this has definitely fired up a lot of questions. I'm going to control all my urges and ask you just maybe 2 more questions. One, of course, is going to, and I think, of course, linked to a key component, the mentoring clinics, and the diagnostics that you were talking about. LinkedIn now has so many mentors as job designations. Uh, but I also realize, and I've heard you speak about the role of mentors and how do you find a good mentor. I'm going to ask my next question around those. How do you make mentoring work for an incubator program?
No, I think that's a very relevant question because a lot of early stage incubation centers tend to think of mentoring as a process of sort of onboarding a mentor and then introducing the startup to the mentor and the magic happening by itself. That really doesn't happen. It may happen in some cases, but the what we have realized is that the optimum way of making mentoring happen for a startup is to make sure that there's a relevant platform or a type of session available where a mentor comes in and gives the specific inputs that a startup requires at that point of time. So we talked about diagnostic panels, where the objective is very clear. It's to diagnose. It's not to recommend. It's not to give suggestions to startups as what to do, what not to do. It's really to help figure out what are the one or two red flags. Now, depending on the startup, depending on the stage, depending on the domain of the startup, you will have to plug in mentors which are relevant for that session. So essentially, the point that I'm trying to make is that a mentor is relevant to a startup for a particular kind of a session that we are doing. It could be a diagnostic panel, it could be a mentoring clinic, it could be a sprint, it could be getting them ready for a demo. All these four are different. So you may need to have a different set of mentors for all four of them. And the stage. So there are these three kind of variables based on which you decide who is the right mentor to bring in for that session, uh, for the stage of startup, and in the domain in which the startup is operating. So essentially, a mentor is very contextual, or the relevance of a mentor is very contextual to these things. To answer your other question, or the first part of the question, we are saying that there are a lot of people, who claim to be mentors, etc. I think that's the kind of sifting that an incubation center has to do. But what I've realized is that once you are clear about what you need a mentor for what kind of a session, for what stage of a startup, it makes it easier. You may, of course, end up with some mentors who claim to be mentors, but they don't have the kind of experience. But I think once you have that clarity on what you need a mentor for, the matchmaking becomes much easier.
I agree, Chintan. I think this is very, very helpful for us to doubly underline the need for incubator managers to clearly specify what should this mentoring engagement lead to. What is the target? What is the goal that we are going after? And use that to be able to identify the mentor as well as design the mentoring format. Very, very helpful. I wanted to reserve one question particularly to talk about sprints, because these are really quote unquote open experiments, or experimental labs that we are able to create for the startup. Could you talk a little about those?
Yeah, no, I think sprints, we have realized over the years, are a very, very important of a program. Typically, they need to be done once your diagnosis and some initial level of mentoring to arrive at possible solutions or ways ahead have been done. Because a startup is all about validation. I mean, there's no right or wrong sort of advice in that sense. It all depends on what is implementable and what's the kind of result it gives in the shortest possible time. So therefore, sprints are a very important component. Sprints essentially are, again, short, time-bound activities which a startup does, typically along with a mentor from the incubation center's side, to validate an important assumption. It could be an assumption about who your target customer segment is. Should you go for a B2B target segment or should you go for a B2C? So you could do a sprint to validate whether it's possible for a startup to acquire whatever a small number of customers at a cost which makes the unit economics work for them. Or it could be an operations sort of a sprint, where you're trying to figure out who are your backend suppliers, and so it could even be meetings with 10 or 15 suppliers, and then getting a sense of which of them is interested to work with you, and trying to then project it on a larger scale. So any small experiment which validates or invalidates a critical assumption based on which you're sort of basing your business model and further growth and profitability, etc. And typically done over a period of, I mean, it could be anywhere from. I mean, there are some sprints which are done over a weekend, and it can go up to 2 weeks, or maybe even up to a month, depending on the domain, depending on what stage it is, and the structure of the program too. But yeah, I think validation of, in a way, it's also a validation of the diagnosis and the advice that comes through the mentors. And it's also a very important way for the startup to understand what's the advice, because once the startup actually validates it and puts it on the ground, then the startup founder gets a sense of what the mentor is trying to say. Why focusing only on B2B or on B2C is very important. So it's also very, very important for the startup founders to be able to absorb the advice that mentors have given to, through these sprints.
Very helpful, Chintan. If you were to see my notepad, this is all scribbled with insights. But if I could attempt making a quick summary of what you shared with us, you of course told us that programs must be anchored to thinking about the phases of a startup's growth. At each phase, the constituents should ideally be adapted to the stage, the needs of the startup at that stage. You spoke about 4 or 5 different constituents that comprise what a program looks like. We spoke about mentoring, and very, very important for incubator managers to be able to define the goal of the respective mentoring engagement. And that mentoring is not just making the mentor and the founder meet each other. That's really just the starting point. And of course, you spoke about sprints as to how they are really the validation of all that your assumptions, maybe what you heard in a mentoring conversation, maybe what you heard as part of a training program, of a boot camp, so to say. Great, this was very, very helpful. And folks that are listening into this conversation, you should be able to see a link of a playbook that we recently published. For incubator managers, particularly from Tier 2, Tier 3 regions. Many of these insights, many of these tools are a part of this playbook. We are hoping that you find it useful. If you have questions around those, you would have our contacts somewhere here. Do reach out. We'd like to know what you think about these conversations as well as the playbook. Thanks, Chintan. This was lovely.
Thank you very much.